I'm talking today to Ernest Edmonds, who is one of the key figures in British generative art, well, generative art internationally. Ernest, people use all sorts of terms to describe what we're interested in, new media art, computer art, digital art and so on. Do you have any strong feelings about any of those?
Yes, I do actually. In a way, digital art covers everything, but therefore kind of means almost nothing. And so the other terms tend to focus on one thing or another. New media art's uncomfortable because it isn't really very new, is it? We're talking about the 50th anniversary of the Computer Art Society.
Yeah.
And all art is made using some medium or another. So I'm not very keen on that term. So for me, I tend to use the term computational art or software art. And that's to refer to the kind of work that interests me, which essentially involves the exploitation of software. Digital art includes, for example, manipulating photographs using Photoshop.
Yes.
Which doesn't involve writing any software or even knowing how software works.
Yes.
And it's a perfectly respectable art form, but it's completely different conceptually.
Yes, good point. I mean, could I start off by asking you to summarise your own contribution to digital art? I mean, I know that's a question with a very long answer.
Yes, it is. So over the next 2 hours, I'll explain. Well, if I just say where I started and where that pointed me, that's probably the best way to do it. So I started by, almost by chance, actually realising that I could write a computer program to help me finish a piece, a relief that was being made by hand, and there were things I couldn't work out to my satisfaction. And this was in 1968, finished in 1969. And I wrote this piece of software which resolved my problem. But of course it led me to reflect upon using software in the art making process. And I suppose the first point was, it led me to understand that my interest in underlying structures in art, which is very strong. For example, perspective is a critical underlying structure for a lot of Renaissance art, and so on and so forth. In music, underlying structures drive a lot of music, and so on. And I was always interested in those kinds of aspects of art making. And using this computer program made me realise that software gave me a great way of pursuing that aspect of art making. And because I was expert in logic, it was a sort of easy way and natural way to go. So that was one thing, and I believe that one of my contributions has been this link from the constructivist tradition, from systems art, which was really based largely on using mathematics and geometry, to software art, where we implemented the kinds of things that were being done using mathematics into software. So it was a relatively small step, but made a very big change. But that involvement made me think about software and its implementation in computers more generally. And so I looked at that time, in the late 60s, at what the implications might be of this new thing, which turned out to be a new medium. And a number of things seemed to be obvious, that time-based work became much more accessible to the visual arts, that interaction became another mode of art making, another aspect of an artwork that could be introduced. So not just colour and form and whatnot, but also interaction, for example. And I also quite quickly realised that communication, so what became known much later as net art, was possible. In fact, I built a network art system in which people communicated with one another through the art system. Around about 1970, just after, before we really had the internet. So it was much harder then, but anyway. So I pointed in these directions. Right? And so I think looking at the implications of this new medium in these different ways would be what I would say was my contribution and exploring those things.
Yes.
Much later, I was able, as the technology advanced, I was able to do things that were much harder to do in those early days. For example, systematizing my study of colour. So no longer judging everything by eye only and thinking, well, I'll just add a little bit more blue into that or something. But actually doing it through software and controlling the characteristics of the colour from within the software. Then, of course, judging the results by eye, of course, some iterative process. But that meant that I made the choice of colour, or the choice of the relationships between the different colours in the work and so on, something that was cogent in the systems art perspective, but was able to be done by using computer software.
There's a lot of points that come out of what you've just said. I'm going through them in no particular order. One of the things that I think some of the early generative artists said was that this is in effect the death of art. We are producing something which doesn't need a human being or even an exceptional human being to do it. The romantic idea of the artist is gone. We're producing something by machine which will one day be as good as the previous art. But you tend to use the image of the artist as a gardener, I think, who sort of, he may choose the plants, but he may prune them, but it's not entirely just left to the plants.
Yes, I agree. Yes. So you can go today, not so far from here, to Chatsworth House, and you can see the gardens of Chatsworth House, the landscape that was formed and constructed many, many years ago, generations ago. That exists because of the human decisions that were made in terms of constructing and planning it.
Do you think there's a difference? I mean, a lot of the early generative artists were German.
Yes.
Do you think there's a difference between the German tradition and you might call it the Anglo-Saxon tradition, but it's British, it's American, it's also largely thanks to you, I think, Australian. The Germans seem to have been brought up on Max Spencer.
Yes, well, Max Spencer, well, yes, and of course that's critically important. He was critically important in terms of that, but they were also influenced by the constructivist tradition, which of course is stronger in Germany and Switzerland than in the UK, although there was really important things did happen in due course in the UK. But there was a more, in quotes, romantic tradition here than that. I think that the notion that you're referring to is a notion of kind of automatic art, that you have a machine that makes art on its own. Well, I have a number of views on that, and first of all, it's nonsense. It's nonsense because a human makes the machine. And all that's happening is that the human, the artist, is lifting their level of concern, you might say, further away from the surface of the work.
Yes.
Okay. So when Sol LeWitt gives a set of instructions, sells actually a set of instructions as an artwork, which someone else can implement. Okay. That's, of course, famously, because he said these things, much the same, but it's still his work. When in the Renaissance studios, artists planned a work and did lots of work themselves, but their assistants did much of it. And we never know quite how much, actually, to be honest. It was, again, much the same. And that the artistry wasn't just in the touch of the brush at that moment, although that was critically important, but also in the planning, if you like, and in the structures that were used for that work. And, I mean, in music, do we say that Bach isn't important in Bach's work? Because, of course, we only ever hear other people playing that work according to his instructions, which were not complete. No piece of Bach tells you exactly how it should be played from the score that Bach wrote. But nevertheless, you hear Bach through that music, I would say, always.
Yes.
You know? So I think it's a mistake, because it's thinking that really this notion that we're talking about is a notion that comes by a strong belief in this romantic tradition of the touch. The fact that you kind of touch it is the art, and that everything else isn't. But if you stop taking that view, then the machine making the art, according to my instructions, is still me making the art.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Just like picking up a phone and ordering an artwork by saying, I want the piece of metal this size and whatever, is making the art. There's another point, which is philosophical, which is art is a human activity for humans. A machine could, theoretically, I guess, make up its mind to make a piece of art, which might be very good for machines to look at or listen to, but it had nothing to do with humans. The essence of art is a human activity by humans for humans, whether using machines, whether using pencils as the medium or computers, it doesn't matter. The purpose is human.
Yes.
And I see no point in art, for us, in art that's purely a machine art.
Yes.
Although it might be great for machines.
I've yet to find a machine that can actually appreciate art.
Yes.
I think that's the other side of the question. I think one way in which your career can be sort of, I'm going to say broken up, that's perhaps the wrong word, but is in a sense following developments in technology, communications technology with the ability to see colours and manipulate colours and sort of things you were describing. Do you feel that people who are doing generative art today are, well, two things. I mean, firstly, all the hard work's been, or a lot of the hard work's been done for them. You can now download processing in a couple of minutes, and it's not a difficult program to use, and you can do all sorts of things which would have taken you and your colleagues a lot of time. Do you feel that that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I think in principle it's a good thing, because a lot of the hard work that we had was not creatively productive. It was just, you just had to do it. And also, very often we had to compromise or limit ourselves. So, for example, in my early time-based work, they were all black and white because I couldn't trust the colour that I could get on the devices at the time to be of the quality or reliability that I wanted. So, everything has improved in this respect. There's always a downside, though, and the downside is the temptation not to think.
Yes.
If anything is easy, then it's tempting not to think about it very hard.
Yes.
But I mean, drawing with a pencil is also easy.
Yes.
To make marks with a pencil is extremely easy.
Yes.
But of course, it's much easier to draw something that's rubbish than to draw a fine.
It's difficult to establish criteria, isn't it? I mean, you can buy books nowadays which are sort of cookbooks of algorithms to use with practicing particular generative art. And you tend to go to conferences, or I tend to go to conferences where you see the sorts of generative artworks, and you can just see, oh yes, he's doing that. It's perhaps difficult to. I don't know how does one establish standards.
Well, I don't know that establishing standards is quite the point, but I mean, the craft is made easier, right? That's for sure. And so, highly crafted work is much less effort, and there's much less craft in it, in a sense, but the quality of the work is much easier to produce because we have all these tools that help us make sure we don't get it wrong. But art isn't craft. Art needs craft, but it isn't craft.
Yes.
And we're not concerned with making beautiful objects. That's what the craftsman does. And that's wonderful, and I enjoy what the craftsman does. But that's not what the artist does. The artist makes art. Art is itself a creative challenge, I would say, in one way or another. So art can be challenging perceptually, it can be challenging politically, socially, it can challenge our notions of beauty. Many things, and different artists do different things, and they're all valid. But having it easy to make doesn't help with making something that is meaningful and is a contribution, is new, and offers a new, exciting, disturbing experience to the audience or the participant.
Yes.
And the point also is that my experience, and this is not just my personal experience, but my experience in working with other artists quite as much as myself, is that no matter where the technology goes in terms of making things easy to do, we always want to do something that the technology doesn't easily allow.
Yes.
So we're always pushing the boundaries.
Yes.
And so I've been as much involved in developing new technology as in making art with the technology that exists.
Yes.
More the former probably than the latter.
Yes.
In order to make it, we have to push the boundaries. And I don't think there's anything particular about digital technology. I think this is true of paint, everything. In the history of art, that the pushing the boundaries of the medium is a natural part of the art making process, because in some ways we're exploring the medium itself.
Yes. I mean, you wrote something somewhere about the difference between symbolic and connectionist.
Yes.
Artificial intelligence.
Yes.
That's perhaps a good example of how things have changed.
Yes.
Over the last few years, and that raises all sorts. I mean, there are a lot of interesting works these days dealing with things like facial recognition and its limitations.
Yes, I mean, so we've got into a situation now where the popular meaning of AI is connectionist AI. Many people refer to AI without knowing that there is such a thing as symbolic AI.
Yes.
And connectionist AI on its own has many problems. And I believe in the end we'll see some blending of the two, but we don't have that really in a serious sense just yet. It's a research problem for the computer scientists.
You've used the term research quite a lot, and I'm aware that a romantic artist would not have said in the context of his art practice, I'm just going out to research a sunset. In what context do you use the word research?
No, well, I mean, I think maybe first of all, it's important to distinguish between what you might call private and public research, or personal and academic research. But so private and personal research is something that all artists do. I mean, we all do. If we're going to go on holiday, we do some research to find out whether this Greek island is better than that one, or whatever, you know. Find out things that other people know perfectly well, and so on. And artists have to do this. Should I use this particular acrylic paint or that one? Or maybe I really need to use oil for this purpose, or something like that. And it doesn't matter whether an artist is romantic or hard nut, they have to do research of that kind. Okay. But let's put that aside, because that's not what I mean when I use the word research in this context. Research in the other context means something that is publicly shared and displayed and open for scrutiny by others. Okay. So, if you're doing research into artists thinking about digital art and you write this up, you have to write it up in a way where people could criticize it and say, well, the methods you used, you missed something, or whatever, you know. Which from personal research, you don't have to do that. You can be secretive about it, in fact, but you can't be secretive, or shouldn't be secretive, about research in this way. And, well, it looks like it's a downside, like you're, giving away all your secrets. But the point about this is that by sharing, we learn so much more. That's what research does. That's how much of the society we live in has advanced through physics and whatnot. Okay, and this is a sort of social process that we go through, and artists, in fact, in private amongst small groups, talk a lot about how they do what they do. Often don't write about it, but I'm quite sure impressionists sitting in cafes drinking wine were talking, about these things, about what they were doing.
And particularly when what you're doing to some extent is playing around with software, trying to see what it will do.
Yeah, and so I certainly talk with, read research and write research about software, partly to share, but that's my contribution so that I can learn from others. It's a deal, if you like, a social deal that we'll do. Now, why has it become important in recent times in the context of our discussion now? Well, it's really largely because of interactive art. And that is because in interactive art, a crucial element of it is the way that human participants behave in relation to the work and how the work behaves in relation to them.
Yes.
And although we might know enough about oil paint to predict whether it'll run down the canvas or not if you put too much turpentine in it or something, we know very little about psychology, in truth, and certainly not enough to predict in any way how people will interact with an interactive artwork.
Yes.
And so this crucial element of an interactive artwork requires another process to be added into the studio somehow or another to find out. So you can't finish the work and then put it out there, because when you put it out there, you find that this crucial element of it is quite different to what you thought. Maybe it's fine, and maybe you don't care, but typically things happen that are surprising and not what was meant. Okay.
Yes.
And so there is a need to do some kind of research about the behavioural characteristics of the artwork. And it turns out, being specific about this example, but I think it's a pretty important example, turns out that the computer science area of human-computer interaction knows quite a lot about not the answers, but how to do that kind of study. And so, so research methods that have been developed in, for example, human-computer interaction, but not only in that area, have become useful to artists.
Yes.
Many artists have then done research about, for example, I had a PhD student who did work on emergence, and the notion of using emergence, the psychological emergence of properties through interaction in artworks, and learning about the nature of different kinds of artworks and different characteristics of artworks that might encourage or discourage these emergent behaviours. Another colleague of mine did work on the nature of play, different kinds of play, and so on. And really, sometimes the artists get quite deep into this kind of research. And in fact, I've just written a book showing how the work that artists have done contributes to the subject of human-computer interaction itself. So there's not just the artist learning from the scientists, but the artist can feed back things that are valuable to the scientists.
Interesting. Another area where you've been perhaps groundbreaking is in documenting your work and in raising the question of whether the documentation is in itself an artwork, your notes series, which you've done in
Yes.
various works that you did.
Yes.
In fact, there's one up on the wall.
There's one behind me there, yeah.
Um,
Well, the starting point for that was odd and anecdotal, as it were, rather than planned, which was I was asked to produce documentation to go with an exhibition, a one-person exhibition of my work, and to show how it developed. And I was a bit reluctant to do this because I don't like these didactic descriptions of I did it because of this and this, that and the other and so on. And so I came up with the idea, rummaging around in my own archives, of giving, if you like, a montage impression of the history of the ideas. I was always interested in concrete poetry, and in fact I wrote concrete poems in my early life. And so that also fed in, so that you could put words and statements in the artwork. So now, I mean, the notes prints that I did use the notions which are quite familiar in 20th century art, from using montage, concrete poetry and so on. So all these ideas were quite normal. And I brought them together in a way that hopefully made artworks in themselves, but that contained information not written up in a linear form, but one idea placed against another. Again, leaving it for the viewer to put these things together and to, if you like, make a narrative out of it. So there isn't a story or a narrative in it. It's a conjunction of ideas, thoughts and images around a theme. So each one has only got one theme. And is a kind of challenge, as I've mentioned in a different context earlier. All art is kind of challenging in some way or another. And I think these notes are challenging in trying to suggest that what one needs to do in looking at it is work out what the essence of the concept was.
The elephant in the room, of course, in any discussion of art is money. How does money flow through the system? And, so could I start off by asking you, I mean, how has your own creative practice been funded?
For the most part, I funded it myself, plus I've obtained sponsorship for it through a number of different routes, but very often by combining the art making with the research. So where I've needed to push the technology forward in order to make a particular line of development in the art, then I've been able to obtain money, sponsorship, for the technological part, using the art part as a demonstration of the advances being made in the technology. So there are ways of presenting what one is doing, where you show the benefit.
Yes.
And the benefit may not be just in an artwork. The benefit might be in other things. And sometimes the other things are more fundable than the artworks themselves. So that's one kind of mechanism that I have personally used. And of course I've just funded things personally myself, as one does.
Are any of your works collected? I mean, are there people who have collections?
Yes. So my work is owned by various people, and the V&A has my work, for example, and individuals have bought my work. But it's not a driver for me. The driver for me is making the work, and is always making the next one.
Do you in fact have any feedback from or contact with people who collect you? I mean, do you know who they are? Do they talk
sure.
to you? This sort of thing.
Yes, but what I guess what I find is that most people are interested in the history. What one finds in the art world is that the latest thing isn't usually the most interesting. The most interesting stuff is older, when something started. So there's a lot of interest for at this moment of time. I'm not talking about my own work here, but for example, early plotter drawings are a big thing at this time.
People like that.
Especially the early ones.
Yes.
And people are much more interested in those than the latest piece.
Yes.
Some people who know more about this than I do have said that it takes about 50 years for art to get recognised, and that would fit with this.
Yes.
Because those kind of drawings, that kind of work is about 50 years old, and so its time has come.
Have you been conscious over the last 50 years of being an innovator, an outsider, or something like that?
Yes.
You find yourself having to justify what you do to people?
Yes, very much so. But that's not that I've felt I had to, but I felt myself to be on the edge. I've always not seen myself as an outsider, but always working on the edges. Because in a way, I think on the edges, between areas, at the boundaries, is where all the excitement is. That's where I want to be. So when last year, 2 different groups of people in 2 different contexts gave me Lifetime Achievement Awards, that was a bit worrying, really, because that meant...
You've become part of the establishment.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I better do something different.
Yes. But I mean, it seems to me that the whole attitude towards digital art, whatever we call it, is changing, and what was regarded in a very strange way in the 70s. Computers were going to solve all our problems in a very naive way. You tell the computer, and the computer would sort of do something. Now we're far more aware of it, and we've all got a computer in our pocket.
Yes.
Attitudes are changing, but still not quite as much as you might expect, I think. And just in terms of prices, for instance, the major prices go to people who are traditional media artists.
I think the computer, the use of computers and software in art is still on the outside, on the whole. If you look at the big galleries, they mostly, until very recently, have done nothing whatsoever with computer-based art. And you just begin now to see a few things happening in the major galleries.
Yes.
50 years after they could have been collecting this stuff.
Exactly. Yes.
And I think it's very strange. But then if you look at like photography, it took a long while before photography was seen as an art form. And I mean, Rodin thought that the photographs that were taken of his work were his work. The photographs were his, because they were photographs of his work. And So even an artist didn't recognise the artistry of the photographer at that time. So I don't know that it's very particular about computing. It's a very big step in the medium. Probably, I mean, I think I've heard people, when I was young, I've heard people say, artists, significant artists, say acrylic paint is for amateurs. Right.
Real men painting
oil. Well, painting oil, and yet, David Hockney, who started painting in oil, I was recently watching a film of him where he was explaining how he'd found this particular make of acrylic paint, which enabled him to do some particular things without going into details, which were quite like what you could do in oil. So he'd moved to acrylic and was now looking for an acrylic paint, which had some of the properties of oil. So, which means acrylic is now fine.
Yes.
Okay. So I think as new media come in, probably throughout the whole history of art, there's been this problem.
Yes.
And the bigger the step, the bigger the change, then the worse the problem.
Yes.
And so I don't think what's happened with computing is surprising.
No, not at all.
Although it's interesting to look at a different area, and I look at music, right, where the use of computing in music is ahead of in the visual arts, not when it started really, but in terms of getting agreement that it's okay and whatever. And it's now kind of quite okay and quite normal, and much of the music you hear has got some computer processing in there somewhere, you know. So visual art is behind music, and if you go 50, 100 years time, people will think it very odd that computer-based art, or art that uses computers in one way or another, was not recognised at this time.
I think there's a feeling among some digital artists that because software is or was, quote, free, unquote, therefore digital art should be free as well. There's very much a sort of anti-capitalist, anti-money feeling among some practitioners. Do you have a view on that?
It's very nice if it's free. Of course, a lot of it is a pretense, because none of these things are. Something has to be paid for somewhere. Someone is usually paying, in fact. So nothing on the internet is free. It may be free to you and me, but someone is paying. Because it usually involves some electricity or some server somewhere, or something that has to be maintained and paid for and whatever. So the notion of completely free is clearly spurious. But should the art be at the kind of prices art goes for is another story.
Yes.
Right. So surely there are examples in the art world of art going for enormous prices that are as ridiculous as the salary of a footballer, which one might complain about just as much.
Yes.
But I don't think it's any different.
Yes.
It's much the same story.
Yes.
And I think it's a story about value in society of everything, and inequality, which is the big thing of today, the recognition that the inequality of income and wealth is a very negative aspect of our society, and that applies to the art world as much as to everything else. So I don't think it's a special art problem.
No.
But it is a problem.
There seem to be effectively about three types of, maybe I'm wrong, but so far, about three types of artists. There are some who produce work largely because they want to, and they don't seem to get very much money from it, and how they survive is beyond me. There are others who have a sort of normal commercial relationship with their dealer and their gallery. And then there's a third set who seem to produce large installations, usually in public spaces and things like that. And it seems to divide up quite neatly into these three.
Yes.
Am I missing anything, or is that?
No, I think that's probably right. And I'm interested in the first and third aspects of that.
Yes.
And I mean, I've just built a piece with a sound artist colleague of mine, shown in a big dome in Montreal, and we're going to work some more on that kind of thing, which will need sponsorship and does need sponsorship, but we don't do it to make money out of it.
No, right. Do you raise the sponsorship yourself?
Yes, yes, or sometimes people come and offer. But
yes.
But I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to all these classes. I agree with your categorization, it sounds pretty good. And I'm very comfortable with all of them. I'm not attracted to the middle one where, in effect, the art making becomes a business. I'm not attracted to it or interested in it personally because my art is too important to me.
Yes.
And I don't want to make things that suit the market.
Yes.
That's absolutely not.
Yes.
And I don't want to even bend them or
Yes.
change the size or.
Well, it becomes a matter of branding, doesn't it? You know, if it's got Damien Hirst's name to it, it will sell for enormous prices. Whereas if it's got my name on it, it'll just be thrown away.
Well, yeah, but you know, so I know people who live from their art only, and as a consequence, pretty much have to take account of what will sell.
Yes.
Or else they don't eat.
Yes.
So it's pretty important.
But when you seek sponsorship, do you find that comes with conditions?
Well, I always have the view that if I don't like the conditions, I don't want the money.
Yes. That's fair enough.
And I don't do it.
Yeah.
And so, yes, one has to compromise on some things, but and I do sometimes compromise. So I'm not going to go into details, but I'm thinking of one example, recent example, where I compromised, but I treated that as a study rather than a final work. And I'm only prepared to present it as a study, which was compromised in certain ways, but was still good enough to enable me to conduct, if you like, the in quotes experiment.
Yes.
That I can call an art a study of, you know, so that the next piece will be better because I did it, so I got benefit from it. But I wouldn't like to present it as a sort of final work in the normal sense.
You've been involved quite a lot with the Computer Art Society, the CAS, haven't you? Would you care to comment on the CAS?
Well, first of all, it introduced me to people and ideas in the first place. So it was always a very valuable meeting place. And it provides a particular network, which I think is probably its greatest contribution, but also as a source of information that wasn't available from anywhere else.
Yes.
As we discussed earlier, the people artists making use of computing found themselves outside of the art world, hardly ever getting reported in the normal art literature, and therefore unknown and unknowable even by other artists, unless there was some kind of way of communicating amongst one another. And the Computer Art Society was critical in this. I mean, in the end, other groupings came about, right? And in fact, I currently chair the board of ICEA, which is a very big international body, which also does this.
Yes.
But in the days of the Computer Art Society, ICEA and all the other such bodies did not exist, SIGGRAPH. None of these groupings existed. So the Computer Art Society was critical in getting this going and enabling this, so that even though it was a UK operation, it was important internationally because of what it offered in terms of this. And in the early days, it was important for actual physical discussions we used to gather together in London, in John Lansdowne's offices very often, for example, and have debate and discussion amongst like-minded people who wouldn't have even known one another had it not been for this society. So historically, it's been pretty critical in that respect. And I think that what you're doing with the interviews, such as you're doing with me now, is important in trying to draw this together, because this is a history that matters, that can influence the future, but needs to be known and recorded.
But what about the next 50 years? I mean, does the CAS have a future, or is it simply a historical memory?
Well, I think it needs to change itself to make that future work. But yes, it has a future, because things are still not sorted out in terms of the position of the work of my colleagues and myself in the art world, and so we still need this activity to take place. I think it's very valuable in terms of like the grey literature area, the informal literature, the informal collections of stuff. We have the Leonardo operation, which is not just digital, of course, it's art and science in a much more general sense, but it includes that. And there's the journal Digital Creativity as well, for example. So there are some formal things going on, ICEA and Saxtigraph and so on. But I think that the Computer Art Society traditionally has offered something that's a little bit more informal, and I think that informal offering is something that's still important and can go forward. I think it will need to find some new vehicles, and I believe it will.
What sort of thing?
Well, I think that the sort of thing I'm thinking about is enabling the publishing of, if you like, manifesto type literature, not highly research project type literature, which could get out into the formal journals, but more informal, but informative work, and work by practitioners. That's not been scrutinised in the, academic sense necessarily. I don't mean it's of poor quality, but I mean it's different. Different, yeah. Yes. And I think that it has a network of people that have come together with their work, and people are interested in showing their work as well as talking about it. And there is a small art collection that the Computer Art Society is developing.
That's with the VNA though, isn't it? Do you mean that one?
No, I don't mean that one though. No, the archives of the VNA, the archives are in the VNA that were collected through System Simulation Limited as part of the historical stuff. But now there is a small new collection being put together, which I think is the kernel of something which could grow and be an important collection, private collection, if you like. Interesting. So I think there are a number of things that need to be done. The Page, a long-standing magazine, which used to be edited in my offices when Dominic Borum was the editor of that, at the time when he worked with me at Leicester Poly, so I have a particular interest in Page because of that, is a very important informal magazine, you might say. It doesn't call itself a magazine, but it is kind of like that, which I think has an important future and could be maybe formalised and expanded in terms of its reach in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed.
Okay.